what's it called? Hate. Haters are doing. But don't bother with it.
Okay, good evening, everybody.
Evening.
Welcome aboard. We have a very exciting week already started, but ahead of us as well, because on the Hasidic calendar this week is tremendously uplifting. It's the time where Hasidus celebrates its own Rosh Hashanah coming up. Let's start from the beginning, starting off with what's going on today, Monday. Sunday night Monday is the anniversary of a very special date on a more recent calendar, and that is that the Rebbe, our Rebbe, that is Rebbe and the Rebbetzin Chaim Mushka, got married in Warsaw, Poland, many years ago, Tafresh Peites, which makes it, I think, 95 years ago. It's a 95th wedding anniversary, and you could say, and the Rebbe actually said this in a Farbrengen, well, what relevance does it make to so many people and gather them together for Farbrengen to mention one or two people's personal own little simcha, their own little wedding anniversary? But obviously the Rebbe didn't make a quiet deal out of it, and that's how we continue to mark the wedding anniversary. In Tovshin Yudal, which was the 25th wedding anniversary, they made a very big deal out of it in 770. It was one of the early years of the Rebbe's leadership, and there was a big Farbrengen at the time, Shabbos, and it was during that Farbrengen in which the Rebbe used the expression, "The Tog vasat verbunden, mir mit eich und eich mit mir." It's the day in which, in an open way, in an open way, it became the day in which connected his personal life with community life, and becoming the Rebbe eventually over all the thousands of Chassidim that he took as leader of fellowship, and the day that connected the fellowship to him, because this is the day that he married into the Rebbe's family. But obviously we understand that the Rebbe, even from a very young age, was something special. And the Rebbe Rashab, which is the grandfather of Rebbetzin Chaim Mushka, he was the one who suggested the shidduch way back when. It took a few years until it materialized. But it was a very special wedding. It was 5,000 people at the wedding. And as we know, there was that many Rabbanim and not many people who had mainly managed to come in. There was cards to get in, very passes to be able to get in. It was like a big deal to get into the hall. But two very important guests didn't make it to the wedding. And those were the Rebbe's father and the Rebbe's mother. It was already during the times of the communist revolution. And in order to get out of Russia, to get into Poland, you needed to get a visa to leave the country. And although the previous Rebbe and his family and the Rebbe managed to get a visa, the Rebbe's father, who was a Schneerson himself, and the Rebbe's mother did not get a visa, even though they applied and they tried to put a lot of pressure. And the Rebbe received a very warm letter from his father before the wedding, telling him that although he wouldn't be able to make it there in person, the Parshah of his Ufruf, which was the last week's reading, where Yaakov Avinu goes to get married in Loventown, miles away from home, and his parents also didn't make it to the wedding. And his marriage worked out very well and just fine, and he'll be okay as well. And his marriage will also work out. He gives all his brachas. But Reb Leivik, the Rebbe's father, and his mother, Reb Tzimchana, back at home, where they were in Yekaterinstav, they created their own little mini wedding. They had 300 guests, which was the smaller wedding. 300 guests came over to celebrate the wedding of their children, and they had a whole wedding ceremony without the bride and groom. They had a tremendous simcha the same night, and I think they even had to break through to the neighbor's house to make space so that everybody could be accommodated. And this was the tremendous simcha of Yudal of Kislev, the day of which we celebrate the wedding anniversary, which is obviously a meaningful day. We can speak hours and hours to describe what the meaning of a wedding and relationships of coming together, and what takes place when a chassan and kala of any level get together, bride and groom. Certainly when a Rebbe and the Rebbetzin set up their next step in their life, it's a big deal for us, and that brings to us, their followers, a lot of koyach, bracha, and tzlacha that we need in our own personal life and in our family life, etc. So that's one big event that's going on this week. And there was a Farbrengen last night, there's a Farbrengen tonight, and people are making a big deal out of it. And even in Tavshin and Beis, there was many big occasions where they marked the Rebbe's wedding anniversary. But all of that is building up the koiches, and it's more recent. But compared to what's coming up this Friday night, what's coming up to this Shabbos, coming up towards us, Friday night Shabbos, what's the Shabbos Sunday? The big day on the Hasidic calendar, Rosh Hashanah LeChasidus. It's the day in which we will complete the Tanya cycle of the whole year. It's the day we'll complete the Hayom Yom cycle of the whole year. And in many communities around the world, it's the day we'll do the Siyum HaShas, completion of learning the entire Talmud, the entire Gemara, obviously divided amongst different people, and each person takes on one tractate, one chapter, and together, as a unified community, we complete the entire Shas on this special day. Why this day? This day became the Rosh Hashanah for Chassidus, in the words of Rashab, and the Rafidi Rebbe told us about it, but it became a marked day from the beginning of Chabad Chassidus. In other circles, it's known as Yat Kislev or Yutes Kislev, or the Rosh Hashanah Chassidus. It's a day where the Alter Rebbe describes how, although for many years he taught and he learned Chassidic teachings, and he basically shared things that were considered secrets of the Torah, and he taught it in such a way that it could be understood in a rational, intellectual ideas levels. So anybody with a brain, anyone thinking as any thinking person, can understand more and more of the ideas, and which was a big deal. It was an innovation, and it was revolutionary in its time. All of this was only to one level, only to an extent as such, until the very famous stories of when the Alter Rebbe was arrested by Tsarist Russia. This is way before the revolution. This is in the times of the Tsar, and the Tsar had received accusations and allegations against the Alter Rebbe, accusing him all sorts, including heresy, treason, and trying to stage a rebellion by supporting the Turks, where Eretz Yisrael, Israel was at the time, and he was sending money. The Ottoman Empire was at war with the Tsar, and many other things that were leveled up against the Alter Rebbe. And for 53 days, the Alter Rebbe, Shnei Zalman, sat in jails, the Tsarist Russian. And during that time, the Tsar, who was a very religious person, had all sorts of questions and interrogations against the Alter Rebbe, which were led by all sorts of officers and scholars, trying to determine whether the Alter Rebbe was using Kabbalah, Talmudic teachings in line with what he considered a faithful citizen of Russia, or he was against it. One of the examples that was the accusations that they were accused the Alter Rebbe was that he was disrespecting the kingdom because he teaches that Malchus, which is royalty, is the 10th, the lowest of all 10 Sephiris, which seems to indicate that his reverence for Malchus is way down the bottom of the ladder. And there's so many things which are greater than the Melech, than the king himself, which at face value seems correct. The Malchus is the lowest of the whole 10. And of course, the Alter Rebbe had to use tremendous amount of knowledge and skill to be able to explain deep ideas in Kabbalah that should be understood to somebody who maybe doesn't have a Talmudic background, certainly someone who doesn't have a Jewish background. And the Alter Rebbe did a fabulous, fantastical job at that. There are stories of where he was leveled with 22 questions, if I'm not mistaken. And he answered each one of the 21 out of 22 questions so well, so brilliantly. And the answers were brilliant. And then they asked him one question, and he just smiled. And he didn't answer the question. And they accepted that as an answer because they realized that had he gone on to explain the answer to that question, he would have made them look like fools. And he knew that they knew that they knew that he knew that it didn't need to be spelled out and explained. So this is the Alter Rebbe sitting in jail. And for 53 days, the Alter Rebbe, the Chassidim didn't know whether he was going to be okay, he would ever be released. And on Yutes Kislev, 19th day of Kislev, they managed to get the release for the Alter Rebbe. And the Alter Rebbe was set free, and he was brought to where he was then, to one of the local Chassidim who lived there. But unfortunately, his taxi ride, his transportation dropped him off in the wrong apartment. It was a 2-family house, and he was dropped off in the wrong apartment, and he ended up in a Jewish person's apartment. But the Jewish person was very Hasidically challenged. He was part of the group who had instigated the entire allegation. Jewish group, very religious, but had made the Hasidically challenged, they misnagged him, had created this untrue, but also very, very dangerous allegation against Alter Rebbe. And when he came free, he ended up coming to a house of one of theirs. And although the fellow gave the Alter Rebbe tea, in which the Rebbe actually, Alter Rebbe thanked him for and was very appreciative for it, but he spent 2 hours in this person's place, and the person really gave him a rough time, tried to make him feel as uncomfortable as they could from a Talmudic or a halachic perspective. Alter Rebbe had to answer him as well. And it's only when they realized where the Alter Rebbe was that they managed to bring him up to the other apartment, to the other house, but the Alter Rebbe was finally set free, and that was already the next day. It was already a Chav Kislev, and therefore, it turns out we have, instead of having a one-day celebration, we end up with a 2-day celebration, Yutes and Chav Kislev. And both days are considered extremely joyous and liberating days. Not because make a wish and whatever you wish for is going to come true, but because these are days that the Alter Rebbe describes how everything that stood against doing the right thing fell by the wayside, to the extent that the parties who were working to bring him down ended up turning around to help him. But also, more importantly, Alter Rebbe explained that everything that played itself out in this world was only an outcome of what was going on upstairs in Shemayim, in heaven. And therefore, the Alter Rebbe explained, if there was an accusation, an allegation against the teachings of Chassidus in the ways the Alter Rebbe was promoting, that's only because in heaven there was an allegation, an accusation against these ways. And the Alter Rebbe explained what the accusation was. The Alter Rebbe explained because he was taking deep ideas, stuff that for generations was a secret that even existed, and now he's making them available to the masses, teaching them to everybody so anyone could understand and use them for whatever struggle they had. And therefore, that taking such a deep idea, sacred part of the Torah, making it almost cheapening it, it came under extreme allegations. Says the Alter Rebbe, although we have these allegations, the fact that we broke through and the Alter Rebbe was set free and he came back to his position, says the Alter Rebbe, this itself indicates that Min Shamayim, they've allowed it to continue, not only to continue, but to continue thriving and growing. And that's exactly what happened. The Chassidim would have a phrase that there was the learnings and the teachings of their Rebbe, the Alter Rebbe, before Leningrad, before he went into jail there in the capital. And then there was the Chassidus of Peterburg. Var Peterburg and Noch Peterburg. After St. Petersburg, after he came out of jail from there, that's when he took on a whole new level of teachings. And as you can imagine, each generation since the Alter Rebbe continued to expound that further and further, until today you can get a podcast and you get a soundbite and you get a little video or an animation that is teaching some of the most complex, deepest ideas. One of my favorite ones is, if you look it up, for Kabbalah Tunes. Kabbalah Tunes is brilliant. Where you have 60 seconds or 90 seconds of a little video of a little girl teaching some of the most complex Hasidic ideas and just simplified in a way that we could all understand it. And of course, the reason why this is being taught to us is that we can have a better appreciation for what's really happening. Where back in the day, it would be normal for a child to listen to whatever their father or mother says to them, and they do it just because they were told to do so. In today's day and age, first of all, that doesn't float. But second of all, our senses, our capabilities require much more. And therefore, it behooves us to have a better appreciation for what it is that we're doing. When I light those Shabbos candles, I can understand that actually this moment in time, where it's the mitzvah to light those candles, it's not just that I'm making it a warm and fuzzy feeling because it's nice to have candles there. The entire chain of creation and every level is waiting for me. And the angels upon high are looking down to see whether or not I managed to activate the next bout of energy that will affect and make a difference on every level. And I can better appreciate that actually every move and choice that I make has powerful meaning to it. Then the next week will be Hanukkah. When I light those menorahs, if I help someone else light a menorah, it actually makes a real difference. And I can understand a little bit of how. By better understanding the makeup of the world, the chain of creation, the relationship between me and my creator, the idea of having an neshama, of what it means to have a neshama that is feeding and empowering the world around. But one neshama connects with another neshama. These sorts of appreciations were secrets, were unheard of in a day of almost a black and white Torah. Baruch Hashem today, with the gift of Yutes Kislev, with the gift of Chassidus, we can begin to appreciate more and more. And that is the celebration of this weekend. This Shabbos is going to be the day of Yutes Kislev, and it's a day of celebration. It's a day of meaningfulness, and it's also a day to take into account, very importantly, the Limud HaChassidus and the Darkei HaChassidus. The Limud HaChassidus translates as the learning of the Hasidic teachings. That's in itself self-explanatory. Learning Hasidic teachings is exactly that. But then there's another entire concept, and that is to figure out and to enjoy and to delve into the ways, the pathways of the Hasidic brotherhood, which was not just intellectual, but that a person should wake up in the morning and feel excited. Not just because today I'm going to buy myself something new. I'm excited because today is another day where I can make a difference, where my life has meaning. And I'm excited to do the next mitzvah. I'm on fire. I'm switched on. I'm excited to meet another person. And the joy in being able to find somebody else thriving. Not because it's nice to be nice, which is also a good start, but because I can appreciate that this is what we were born for. This is my life calling. This is Yutes Kislev. This is the excitement that's going on this week. So over there, every week we say this is the most important week. But to this week is really, this week, Yutes Kislev, it's Rosh Hashanah, and it's Rosh Hashanah LeChassidus. Very, very important day. And the bracha to everyone is, Ksiva Chsiva Tova, Yeshana Tova, Belimud HaChassidus, V'Darkei HaChassidus, Tikasei V'Chasem. So that's what's going on this week. Moving right into our second part, the second portion of tonight's class, which is what's going on in the Parshah. Now, before we jump in, I do want to say that we had last week a 20-year Parshah. Parshas Vayetze was a 20-year Parshah in which we learned from beginning to end of Yaakov Avinu leaving the Holy Land of Israel, going far, far away to Lavan town, and it's there that he set up an entire family, and he became extremely wealthy, and he's now riding back. In the end of last week's Parashah, he's heading back to Israel. So the entire Parashah is while he was more or less away from the Holy Land. This week's Parashah is the next step of the story. Yaakov Avinu has already graduated that major segment of his life, of where he spent 20 prime years of his life in difficult circumstances, dealing with Uncle Lavan, with a swindler, with an environment that's very counterproductive, not very helpful at all to his Yiddishkeit, to his mission in life. But actually, it's exactly where he begins to thrive. And that's where he builds a family. This week's Parshah, Vayishlach, opens up where he's finally coming back to town. Now, just to connect the dots, Yaakov Avinu leaves his home. His parents tell him he has to go way back, way far away in order to find a wife. And as the Torah clearly tells us, really, they were concerned for his life because he had outsmarted his brother with the brachas, with the blessings from his father. And then he was mad at him, his twin brother. He was after him for his life. And therefore they told him to go away. And therefore don't be in harm's way. And also don't incite him. It won't be in his eyes. He won't be remembering it. Now, 20 years later, Hashem has told him on the short way. Hashem has told him, come back. And he was headed back home. And it's this point where he all of a sudden realizes it has been 20 years. But who's to say? His twin brother Esav has been appeased, has calmed down in any way. Maybe he's just as mad. Who's to say that when he comes back to town, he's not going to get into the lion's den? And therefore, as the parasha opens up, Parshas Vayishlach, Yaakov Avinu realizes that he's going back home, but with that comes the major dangers of meeting his twin brother, who he's fled for 20 years and now going to meet up. And it's going to be a long process. until he finally has the meetup. And the Torah describes in detail about Yaakov's fears, about Yaakov davening and preparing for this meeting. And along the way, we learn they actually made not just a small preparation, he made a three-pronged preparation in three different tracks. On the one hand, Yaakov Avinu prepared for strategy. Should it come to an extent where they have to fight it out, Yaakov prepared himself to be best prepared, whatever it would take. And he came with the best strategy, and his opinion was to do a split camp movement where they would have two armies, if you like. And if Yaakov would attack one side, the other side would be able to come and counterattack, or to try and protect, or at least be able to escape should there be a problem. But that was only one form of preparation. Alongside that, Yaakov also strongly prayed, davened to Hashem, and davened to Hashem to protect him, to save him, even by way of miracle, should it be needed. And then the third part of the approach was expect the worst and hope for the best. Hope for the best is exactly what Yaakov did, and he did something about it. He made sure to send Esav a string of the most wowing gifts he could send. And it wasn't just he sent him a very large gift. He sent him a gift and then created a bit of space and sent him another gift and then another space and another gift. And each messenger came before Esav with his gift and with the message that this is from your brother Yaakov, who seeks to become friendly to you and appreciates how you're the older one and seeks to appease you. The message, the reconnaissance mission that Yaakov had sent, had come back saying that Esav was still really upset and looking forward to a confrontation that would fight it out. And he was determined to hurt Yaakov. And Yaakov's mission and response was obviously going to protect himself and he's going to daven, but he's going to respond with loving kindness in a very practical and specific way by sending the gifts. And guess what? It actually worked. Because Yaakov Avinu, when he finally meets Esav is turned around. However, between that time, when the messengers go with all the gifts and that fateful morning when they meet together, Yaakov Avinu still has a couple of things that are going to take place. Number one is he's got to position himself across the river Yabok, the Yabok River, and there, as he's crossing over the river, he moves and ferries all his belongings over from one side to the other. And as the Torah describes, he's just about finished moving everything over, and he left some few things behind. Yaakov even goes back over the river one last time on his own. And there's no one left there, and that's where he has the confrontation between him and the angel of Esav. Esav's guardian angel picks a fight with Yaakov, and Yaakov Avinu and this angel wrestle the entire night. What does it mean to wrestle with an angel? Obviously, it's a spiritual wrestling, but it was a battle of whether Yaakov Avinu would prevail over Esav, or Esav would definitely get the better of Yaakov. And until morning, Yaakov pinned him down, not before the angel managed to hurt Yaakov. And Yaakov is pinning down the angel has to leave because it's in the morning, and he asks the angel to give him a bracha, which he does, and thereby concedes the blessings that Yaakov had received from Yitzhak should be his. He gets a new name. He's named by the angel Yisrael, which Hashem backs up, and then the angel leaves. And as the morning rises, Yaakov is injured in his thigh, and we find in this week's Parshah one of the earliest mitzvahs that are recorded in the Torah. But it's not a mitzvah yet, it's not in the commandment, but it's a futuristic pasuk that describes that eventually the Jewish people will never eat from the sciatic nerve in the back side of an animal, based on this story where Yaakov's injury was in a sciatic nerve, and then the sun rises and heals Yaakov. And as Yaakov is healed, he continues on, and he continues towards the oncoming, marching Esav with his men. And when they finally meet up, Yaakov's camp is split into two. He's been davening all the time. He's sent the gifts and he's tried his best to wow him with love. And at the very moment where Yaakov and Esav meet, all of a sudden Esav can't hold on to his anger anymore. It dissipates. He runs over and rushes over to Yaakov, hugs him and kisses him, and falling to the shoulders and cry. And Esav says, "Come, Yaakov, my dear brother, let's make up. Come to my house, come to my place. I'll put you up, I'll look after you. Let's make it work." And Yaakov Avinu hears his twin brother overcome with emotion and this turnaround in an instant, how he all of a sudden is so warm and welcoming. Yet Yaakov Avinu is realistic, and very carefully and cleverly he declines the offer and creates and continues to create the space needed for him and Yaakov to prosper and to continue. And he says to Esav, I'll come on my own pace. You go ahead. I'm really slow. I've got lots of cattle, lots of youngsters. You're a young man. You're a fit man. You've got a whole army. You go ahead. I'll make my way over to you. Yaakov understood that right now was a moment of compassion, of change of heart. But who's to say? But with a very short space of time, Esav could turn around. It's best to leave it on a pleasant note and create space. And thereby they'll be able to be friends from afar. And that space, we're allowing each one of them to go ahead and do what they needed to do in their own choices in life, yet have the warm spot for each other, is exactly what Yaakov created, and it worked. Right after this story, we have the story where Yaakov is just about shaking off this tremendous danger of Esav and his 400 men. Right after the story the Torah describes, that Yaakov Avinu doesn't get a peaceful moment. Right after this, Yaakov Avinu pitches up a tent and buys a plot of land outside Shechem. Outside Shechem. Shechem is in the Holy Land of Israel. Still is today. There's been a lot of activity in Shechem recently. He's got to be only with good news. But that place turns out to be that in Shechem, where the prince of Shechem, Hamor, comes over and effectively kidnaps or entices Dinah, Yaakov Avinu's daughter, rapes her, and manages to convince her to stay with him. And eventually he wants to marry her. And he sends over his father to Yaakov to try and do a deal that he shall allow his daughter to marry into their tribe. Yaakov is shocked by what had happened. And as the boys, the tribes, come home and they find out what happened, they say that we're going to deal with this. And they trick the entire town of Shechem, the entire tribe of Shechem, to circumcise themselves. And they say that if you do circumcision, without circumcision, we can't talk. If you guys circumcise yourself, and then we can no problem. We'll get together, we'll marry each other, it'll be great. All of this was a deceitful plan. And third day after the circumcision of the entire tribe took place, Shimon and Levi descend upon the tribe and kill out every male inhabitant of the entire tribe in retribution for them allowing their prince to kidnap and rape the daughter, which was considered illegal, but it was the prince, and they were turning a blind eye, and they paid back the entire tribe. But yet when they come home with Dinah and they make it back to the tribe, Yaakov is furious. He's very unhappy with their behavior, and he tells them anything that they stole, any money that they took off the tribe, even if they perhaps could rightfully own it, he insists that they don't take a penny. They leave it all behind, and he picks himself up, and he says, actually, I have an unsettled promise that I made to Hashem. It was almost 22 years now, when I left home, all the way back when, in the beginning of Parshah Vayishlach, and I had a dream of the ladder going up and down with the angels. And when I woke up in Beis El, and I said that when I come back safely, I'll come here, and I'll make a mizbech, a matzeva for Hashem, and that's an outstanding promise that I've yet to fulfill. Yaakov picks himself up with his entire entourage, with all his children and all his cattle, and he heads over to Beis El, and that's exactly what he does. It was along that journey that Rachel dies in childbirth with the 12th of the 12 tribes of Binyamin, and Rachel is buried on the wayside, on the roadside instead of bringing her in to the cave of Machpelah, of where his father and his mother, his grandfather and his grandmother were buried, Yaakov Avinu buries her on the wayside, and that's where she would be buried, so that her children and the descendants who were being led out into exile were being able to daven there, the Shirachim of Akala ben Albanah. It's also the story of Reuven. After Rachel dies, and Yaakov Avinu places his bed in Rachel's maidservant's tent, and Reuven wants to stand up for his mother's respect and tries to move Yaakov's bed into Leah's tent, and Yaakov gets a few areas very upset with him. But eventually, Yaakov Avinu arrives in Hebron, to where his father lived, and finally he comes back to his father after not having seen him for 22 years. And that's where he stays until his father passes away, 180 years old. And there he's buried also in the cave Machpelah, where his wife Rivka had already been buried. And the very end of the Parshah describes a whole bunch of psukim that are dedicated to Yitzchak's other son, Esau, and his line of all their descendants and all the different kingdoms that were to come up. And in a one quick sweep, in a whole bunch of psukim, but in one parasha, we have the continuation of all of Esau. And at the end of next week's parasha, we'll open up with story after story that will describe what happens with Yaakov's descendants, the 12 tribes, the continuation, all the way through the giving of the Torah, the building of the Mishkan, all the way through until we traverse through the desert, till we get almost in Eretz Yisrael. So this is next week's parasha. It's Parshas Vayishlach. The name of the parasha, when Yaakov sends the messengers to find the reconnaissance, to scout out where Esau is up to. We have the story of him confronting and preparing for Esau. We have the story of the angel. We have the story of the confrontation itself, the story of Dinah and Shechem, and all the way through to the end of the parasha. Many, many pages and pages of Sfarim that have been written on these texts of the parasha. We're going to focus on today Yaakov Avinu's strategy for overcoming Esau. And the reason why we're going to focus on this is because adversity is not only sometimes a thing. I would suggest that every single person that we meet, certainly each one of us, have adversity and have to deal with it. The strategy for dealing with opposition, be it someone at work, be it someone at home, be it someone when I look at the mirror, or maybe just obstacles and being able to achieve whatever it is I've set myself out to do. If I'm setting myself out to do something good, positive, and there is disturbance, distraction, strategy for dealing with that is important, is essential. Now, obviously, strategy plays itself out differently in each circumstance, but a general strategy to take from Yaakov, who was faced in this week's parasha with a real opposition, is going to be important. And the Hasidic teachings will tell us, living with the times, there is real, usable, actionable, relevant information this week's parasha can teach us about how we can make that work. So if anyone has any quick one-line ideas of what sort of strategy works for you or is something you've worked towards, what could you suggest? Anybody, please.
Maybe think something through before you strategize it. Think it through carefully before you run and rush in. Because
I'm hearing two things. Number one is don't rush.
Yeah.
Take a moment. And number two, use the moment to think it through and to be the bigger picture maybe, or to be level-headed about it. So number one, again, maybe it's the same thing. Don't rush. Give yourself space. And then prepare yourself before we move forward. Amazing. Exactly what Yaakov Avinu did. He didn't rush towards Esau bearing a sword. He slowed down, took a moment. Fantastic. Anyone else want to weigh in on this one? What else could be useful information that we can pick up from Yaakov, or something that works for you? And we'll see if Yaakov did it or didn't do it. Strategy for dealing with disturbance towards good or positive things we're going to do.
I've had situations where you want to respond to emails. So what you do is make a response and then just put it aside come back to it later, read it, and
Love
then
it.
revise it.
Amazing. So I like that idea, especially because you get to vent your emotions, and then before it can have a chance to do any damage, I get to come back and look it over and rewrite it or tweak it up. Amazing. Very much the idea of not rushing into it. We're going to take that on board. We're going to take both these points on board, but also we're going to focus on the way the Sikh and Chelek Chaf describes this. We're going to notice something about Yaakov and Esav, where it seems like Yaakov has almost supernatural powers, and therefore maybe something we can't emulate. And the Sikh is going to argue we can do exactly the same, not because we're miracle workers, but because the strategy that Yaakov does when he takes that moment is not just to do the best that he can, is to do what the best that he can 100%. In short, if he's presenting goodness, he's going to focus on that and focus on the good thing he has to do. And that's the main thing. Whatever else he can help along his side, he's going to do the best he can. But none of that is going to change the good thing I've set myself out to do to the best that I can help it. In other words, I cannot be dependent on winning over an outside party for me to have to do what I need to do. If I'm able to help, I'm sure going to try to do that. But my life isn't dependent or in the hands of somebody else. I'll write the story of my life, and if I'm committed to doing something good, 100%. 100% not to back down in the face of adversity, whether it's another person, or it's the tide of what people are saying, or it's just an uncomfortability. If it's the right thing to do, I'm going to try to my very best to do that. And in a way, we're going to notice, at least according to one of their opinions, this is what Yaakov did. And certainly if we're gearing up to Rosh Hashanah for Chassidus, it's okay for us to use a little bit of the mystical Hasidic spin on what the story teaches us and use it as a very practical tool of how we need to encourage ourselves to try and respond every time we face adversity, wherever it comes from. Try and respond if we can. Here we go. So this is the text. Sorry, please.
I was just going to say, wasn't one of the things that Yaakov did when he took space in between delivering the animals and a space and getting somebody to do it, he was also scared. So he did have a strategy, but he was very scared of what would happen. And the point of the strategy that he used was to elongate it somewhat, so that by the time he actually met his brother, he thought that if there are any bad thoughts on his brother's side, maybe they would have dissipated a little bit, and he gave himself time. Sometimes when you're facing something, you don't have the time to do that. The time when you sometimes need to have a strategy is a time sometimes you haven't always got, depending on what's happening. Sorry.
Wow. Yeah, very much so. In a way, I'm going to say that what you've just described, Yaakov did have time and he did create space. It's true. But in the larger picture, Yaakov also, he had 20 years before this.
Mm.
And the 20 years hadn't done the trick. So he did use this a bit of time left that he had, whatever few days he had, to create the space and to slow down his approach. And the meetings to take longer. But at the end of the day, he didn't have endless time. And perhaps we can borrow the same sort of strategy. Whatever time I do have, I'm going to use to the best of my ability. And when time runs out, I'm not stranded. When time runs out, I know what it is that I want to do. I want to give it my very best shot. And then just forge forward.
Mm-hmm.
So he, in a way, Yaakov teaches even us, or even in a time where we don't have the luxury of time, we have what to learn, but let's see it inside, let's build it up. And Bez Hashem, in the next 20 minutes, we're going to try and walk away with how we can put this into practice. Let's start off with the psukim, the way it's in the Parshah. The Parshah says, Vayishlach Yaakov Einav, Yaakov lifted his eyes and saw, and behold, Esav was coming. And with him were 400 men. So he divided the children with Leah and Rachel and with the two maidservants. And he placed the maidservants and the children first, and Leah and the children after, and Rachel and Yosef last. And he went ahead of them and prostrated himself to the ground 7 times until he came close to his brother. And then Esav ran towards him and embraced him, and he fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. So in those short moments, literally until the very last second, Yaakov could see it wasn't turning out well. This was going downhill, and it was going fast. Yaakov's watching Esau charge towards him with 400 men, and he has to go into plan B. He goes into battle mode. Yet even as he's in battle mode, frustrates himself 7 times. He comes closer to him, puts himself first, but something gave way. And in those short moments, all of a sudden, it all changed. In one moment, in one flash, Esau has a change of heart, falls on his neck, kisses him, and they weep. Interesting, very interesting. And Rashi is bothered, not so much about what happened, what's the missing point? How did it all of a sudden change so drastically? And Rashi points out when he hugged him, it was okay, that's already drastic. But the difference between getting a hug and then kissing it out, that's a whole nother level. Rashi wants us to notice that on the word, and he kissed him, Vayishlach, in the Torah, you see it on the screen here, there are actually dots on top of the Hebrew word Vayishlach, dot on top of each letter. Now the rule is that whenever there's dots on top of, according to tradition, when dots appear on top of a word in the Torah, they are meant to minimize the meaning of the word. It's as if it says, this is what happened, but it happened in a minimalistic way. So Rashi wants us to notice that it says, and he kissed him with dots on top, and Rashi brings us 2 explanations. Says Rashi, and he kissed him. In the original Hebrew, there are dots over the word. There's a controversy concerning this matter among the Talmudic sages. Opinion number 1. Some sages interpret the dots to mean that he did not kiss him wholeheartedly. Says Rashi, although it embraced him and kissed him, it was outward, and he didn't really have feelings towards him. I mean, 20 seconds earlier, the guy was charging to kill him. He was charging in a battle towards Yaakov. But he had a change of heart. It wasn't completely wholehearted, but it was saved his life. And it was as good as if it was. It helps us appreciate that although it seems very strange how one led to the other, Rashi wants it to tone it down. But then there's a second shot, which Rashi also brings, and says, actually, although it's dots on top, Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai said, this is a double negative. What's a double negative? Negative means it's positive. Okay? Says Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, it's a well-known tradition that Esau hated Yaakov. Okay? So if the tradition is that Esau hates Yaakov, then it's impossible that kissing means wholeheartedly. Says the dots on top of the Torah. His compassion was moved at the time, and this time he did kiss him wholeheartedly. So the first negative is to accept, says Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, that Esau certainly doesn't like Yaakov. Negative number 1. Then there's dots on top to say, actually, he didn't do what he usually would have done. So if usually it would say Esau kissed Yaakov, that would have been a wholehearted kiss, because we know that the tradition is Esau never shows compassion for Yaakov. But minimize that. Minimize the assumption that Yaakov would never get compassion from Esau. Says Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, this time it was wholehearted. Interesting Rashi. On one hand, maybe it wasn't wholehearted. On the second hand, it wasn't not wholehearted. Get it? It wasn't not wholehearted. This is the 2 opinions. And the Chassidus wants us to focus on and zoom in on what Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai says. Why so? Because Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai is the author of the Zohar, almost one of the forefathers of the mystical teachings, and Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai's messaging, which is quoted in Rashi. Unlike Rashi, he doesn't usually bring a second commentary unless it has messaging or a better understanding for us. The Sikha wants us to appreciate that there's a tremendous key life strategy that Yaakov is teaching us in the eyes through the lens of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai and the secrets of Torah. So let's move along and see what it is. Rashi's question was, how did Esau all of a sudden have such a quick change of heart? And he gave us two answers. Answer A, Esau's kiss was insincere, an obvious minimization of the plain meaning of the word. And answer B, Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, Esau's kiss was sincere, because this particular instance being an exception to the usual rule that Esau hates Yaakov. Okay, so if Esau's kiss was sincere, what changed from the well-known tradition that Esau hates Jacob? How did it turn around? What was the key? What was the strategy that Yaakov used that managed to change an age-old, a well-known tradition? It's actually, the words are halacha. It's a tradition that Esau hates Yaakov. What did Yaakov have? What was it about Yaakov prostrating himself in front of Esau that all of a sudden, magically, in the ninth hour, managed to turn it around? So in order to understand this, we're going to learn a couple of texts. Number one is, what do we know about Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai? Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai always expounded the inner secrets, expounded reasoning underlying the verse of a basis of drawing halachic conclusions, and that's a quote from the Talmud. The Talmud already, before you get into Kabbalah, describes Rabbi Shimon as the one who looks into the deeper secrets. Now, obviously, Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, we know quite a little bit about Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai from the famous Lag BaOmer highlights. Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, who's buried in Meron, was a fire of a scholar, of a Talmudic sage, and who brought to us enormous amounts of greatness. But we also know that Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai was unafraid to stand up to the Roman Empire. And as the story is told in the Talmud, it's a text 3a and 3b, where there was a time when the Romans had taken over Israel, and they made major upgrades to the entire cities and created bridges and highways and all sorts of bathhouses and so on, fantastic things. And Rabbi Shimon famously described how he doesn't appreciate anything. If anything, this just describes how terrible the Romans are. They're trying to take away tradition from the city, and they're only trying to further their own agenda, which is against the agenda of the Jewish people. And when the Romans found out, they were after Rabbi Shimon for his life. To the extent Rabbi Shimon had to go out and hide out in a cave, and he had no food. In the beginning, there was some water and some meat. Eventually, the spring came out, and the tree grew there, and he and his son sat there for 12 years, and then another year, 13 years, they hid out in the cave because of what he had done to stand up to the Romans. Here you see that Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, as an individual, was a very fiery, deep, great scholar, a tremendously pious individual. But that also meant that he was unafraid to do what had to be done and whatever it needed to be done, even if it meant risking his own life, even if it meant getting himself into serious trouble. But he had to do what he had to do, and he did that unapologetically. Interesting, there's another quote in Talmud Me'ilah, that seems to say that although Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai stood up to the Romans, and the Romans for 12, 13 years were after him for his life, he was considered a real threat to the Roman Empire. Yet, after the emperor died, the next emperor pardoned him. That's how it worked. They wouldn't hold on to grudges from previous emperors. And so now all of a sudden, he's no longer after him for his life. He's definitely not a friend of the state. But somehow, when the Jewish people needed to come to the next emperor and plead for some decrees that had been leveled against the Jewish people, they looked to see who can they send to plead on their behalf. Guess who they chose to go to the next emperor? Who would be the representative who would beg and request on behalf of the Jewish people? None other than Rabbi Shimon himself. And they said, Rabbi Shimon, he's the one who's Melumet Benissim, who's the one who can take care and can achieve miracles. If we need to send somebody, it's going to be Rabbi Shimon. And he goes, and he travels to Rome, and exactly that happens. He manages to overturn the decrees against the Jewish people, and he manages to secure freedom for the people. Rabbi Shimon, the same individual who was the enemy of the state. And in a way, this helps us appreciate something very interesting about Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, as we learn in the Lag BaOmer story, came out of the cave after 12 years. When he came out of the cave after 12 years, He was so supercharged, high voltage scholar. He had spent 12 years doing nothing else but studying Torah, connecting with Hashem himself in the most extreme, uber way. And the first time Rabbi Shimon comes out of his son, come out of the cave, father and son, Joe take divergent approaches on how to re-engage with the world they had left for so long. Whenever they moved, they looked at people working, things zap. And they look at it. Here's a guy working the field, wasting time instead of studying the Torah. Things went up in flames. They literally created devastation wherever they moved. Out of their sheer holiness, they couldn't fatrok. They couldn't handle. Thank you, good word. Yeah, any sort of deviance from absolute servants of Hashem, and therefore they created a devastation till a sound came out from heaven and said, "I've created a world. Are you here to destroy it? Go back into your cave." Which what they did. And as the Talmud describes, they came out of the cave 1 year later, and as they came out of the cave 1 year later, whatever had been destroyed, Rabbi Shimon Yochai made it his business to try and rectify. And here they became the healing force of Rabbi Shimon. Amar Chizkiah, Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, Mishum Shimon Yochai. Chizkiah said in the name of Rabbi Yirmiyah, in the name of Rabbi Shimon Yochai, Yochel ani lifter es kol ha'olam kulei min hadin. I can absolve the entire world from judgment for sins committed from the day I was created until now. Famously, in the days of Rabbi Shimon Yochai, there was never a rainbow in the sky. And as we are taught, Chazal tell us this is because Rabbi Shimon Yochai made it his business to absolve the wrongdoings of all the people of his entire generation. Any sin that was committed was absolved to Rabbi Shimon Yochai. This is one of the fascinating things. Rabbi Shimon Yochai, when he came out of the cave the second time, he became an energy of healing, of finding people. But the Sikha wants us to notice. He doesn't say here, I can atone for every individual. I can rectify the wrongdoings of every individual. Even as people who continue to do things wrong, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai can highlight and dig to discover the redeeming factors within the sinner and the wrongdoer, whilst they're still yet to do teshuvah and to uncover a deeper reality where they are also absolved, even though they still haven't done their repentance or teshuvah. And that's a very deep level. In other words, it's not about ignoring the sinner. It's not about changing the sinner and helping them do teshuvah, which is fantastic. When even that fails, being able to uncover a depth that will allow the sinner as they are to all of a sudden reconnect before they even get a chance to change their ways, that is what Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was capable of. He was a healing force to a world that had not yet changed. This is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai after his second coming. The power to bring healing to a world as the world operates, and not necessarily as the Torah says it should operate. Still, Rabbi Shimon was so super focused on the world that Hashem had created, the creation of Almighty God. Says Rabbi Shimon, I am now ready to find goodness in everything, even if it's not good. That sort of koyach, this is text 8, Rabbi Shimon's approach is such he didn't need to bring the entire world to teshuvah. Rather, Rabbi Shimon's approach tolerates a world that's still mirrored in a situation that warrants judgment due to inappropriate behavior. And yet, I can absolve the entire world from judgment for sins. In a way, this is far greater than affecting change in the world. When the lower party is elevated and ceases to be low, namely the evil is cancelled and transformed, that's one level. Rabbi Shimon goes a step further and says that godliness can reach and impact the lowest of places, even in its lowly state. The evil in its own natural habitat can be absolved by digging deeper and deeper still. Says the Sikh in Chaf, this sort of power, this center of energy that was needed in order to do this, was something that Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai achieved, and it was something that Yaakov Avinu also achieved. And at that moment, when Yaakov met Esav, this was his strategy. Yes, indeed, he prepared for war. And yes, indeed, he sent gifts. And yes, indeed, he davened. But then he said, you know what? I'm going to insist on finding and digging deep to be able to find the good in anyone and everyone, and even when it's not obvious. Better said, even when it's obvious that it's not, I will continue to insist that there must be goodness in here, and I'm going to forge forward. Yaakov Avinu had what it took. We're going to learn soon in a moment where he found this power. But this was the miracle of Yaakov. And this was the miracle of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. The ability to lock in to this mindset that everything that takes place must have in it goodness. And even though it's threatening me right now, I must forge forward with complete confidence that there must be goodness in here. And that's what happened to Yaakov. And that's what happened to Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. He didn't say, I'm sure everything is going to work out the way I want it. But he said, I'm sure that this is part of the goodness plan of Hashem, and I'm going to forge forward. Even Esav, the gangster, who's coming and approaching me, Yaakov on his level was able to see goodness in Esav to the extent where Esav could not remain unmoved. And Esav falls on his shoulders. Interestingly, here we go. Yaakov was accustomed to experiencing miracles, so though the rule is that Esav hates Yaakov, Yaakov was able to influence him so much that his mercy was aroused at that moment, and Esav kissed him wholeheartedly. Interesting. Since Yaakov possesses the same miraculous quality of overwhelming opposition, for the few moments that Esav stood in his brother's presence, he hadn't become a different person. He was still Esav the gangster. And it explains why Esav invites Yaakov, and Yaakov said, I'm not coming home with you. Because although you've kissed me, hugged me now, that's not who you are. Esav's still a gangster. But whilst he's in his presence of Yaakov, he was overwhelmed with goodness and sincerely reached out with an emotional kiss. It wasn't insincere. It just wasn't long-lasting. It was a moment. Because when in the presence of such absolute 100% lock-on, in insistence, in doing the right thing, and believing that Hashem is in control, and that moment, even Esav, who hasn't changed, who is still a terrible behaving individual, cannot stay unmoved in the moment. And that's why Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai says, of course, Esav still remained Esav. But the kiss was sincere because of Yaakov's credit. In the presence of Yaakov, it was sincere. Turns out that both the first opinion and the second opinion, whether this kiss was insincere or the kiss was sincere, either way we accept that Esav was still a gangster. Somehow, Yaakov managed to turn it around in the moment. And what was the key? The key was his ability to lock on, to know with absolute confidence that this is what's going to be good. This is where his goodness is going to come from, because Hashem has set it up so. We're out of time. The next few quotes were here to tell us that Yaakov and Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai both had one weapon that they practiced so that when it came to the moment, the strategy was able to work for them. They, the word is practiced, but they used this koyach. They exercised this koyach, this ability to be able to make it come over and over again. And what was the power that they used, that they exercised? And the key is going to be learning Torah. Think like Hashem. The more we learn Torah, the more we learn and train our minds to think godly. And when we think godly, then even when things look like there's a gangster in front of me, there's real adversity, I can still insist on thinking like Hashem. Rosh Shimon bar Yochai, Torah and Manasseh, and Yaakov Avinu was also the power of Torah, and this was the idea of Yaakov Avinu. All in all, to summarize what we said today, when we are faced with a situation where it looks like it cannot be and it's not going to work out, it looks terrible, the first thing we need to remind ourselves is we have to do the best we can, whatever that takes, whether it includes taking a moment to think, taking a moment to be able to try and engage, to discuss, to open up lines of communication, whatever else it might contain. But at the core of what it happens, the strategy must always include confidence in knowing that as long as I do what is the right thing to do, Hashem will be with me. Even though Esav is still here at the 9th hour, still standing and marching towards me, Yaakov is 100% confident it's going to be good. And that power he garnered from is thinking like Hashem that he found in Torah, just like Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And when he was able to do that, the badness dissipated. If not long-term, certainly in its relationship with him. Hashem should give us the koyach. Hashem should give us the passion, the clarity to know that when things look bleak, they definitely look that way. It doesn't mean they are that way. We have to make the necessary preparations, but we must try, dig deep, to find the goodness within ourselves, to have the confidence that what's facing us is also goodness, and Hashem should give us the koyach to be able to see the goodness as it plays itself out in reality. Here we remain on good news. Thank you very much for joining. It should be Vayishlach the Gevach. It should be a meaningful week with Yutes Kislev, and the excitement of Limud Chassidus and Darkei Chassidus should be able to make good things happen. Everybody.